Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I still recall how the quiet wrapped around that old house like a heavy blanket. Back then, our little place on the Navajo reservation didn't have electricity, so the only light came from lanterns glowing in the living room. My two brothers and I were left alone that night, since our parents had headed to a chapter house meeting. It wasn't the first time they'd left us to watch over things, but something about that evening felt off. We'd gone through our usual routine, made a quick dinner from whatever we could rustle up. Growing up on the reservation taught me to appreciate the simplicity of our lives. We lived miles from the nearest town, surrounded by vast stretches of desert and mesa that seemed to extend forever under an endless sky. Our modest home stood as a lone sentinel against the elements, a small, weathered structure that had sheltered generations of my family through harsh winters and scorching summers. The isolation never bothered me before. In fact, I found comfort in the rhythm of our daily existence, the rituals of gathering water, tending to livestock, and maintaining our small garden plot. My brothers and I developed a deep connection to the land, learning its secrets through stories passed down by our grandparents who lived just down the road. Grandfather always emphasized the importance of respecting the natural world. "Everything has a spirit," he would say, his weathered hands gesturing toward the horizon. The mountains, the water, the wind. They all remember how you treat them. As children, we absorbed these teachings without question, incorporating them into our understanding of reality. But as we grew older, we began to recognize the complex relationship between these traditional beliefs and the modern world that existed beyond our isolated corner of the reservation. My older brother embraced the old ways completely, spending hours with grandfather learning prayers and rituals. My younger brother seemed torn, fascinated by stories of city life he heard at school. I fell somewhere in between, respecting our heritage while curiosity pulled me toward experiences beyond our secluded home. That tension between worlds created a unique vulnerability, especially on nights when our parents attended tribal meetings. The responsibilities of maintaining the household fell to us, creating a strange power dynamic that shifted with each sunset. As the middle child, I often found myself mediating between my brothers' conflicting approaches to problems. The night everything changed began ordinarily enough. Mom and Dad packed a few belongings into their old pickup truck, promising to return by morning. "Keep the lanterns lit," Mom reminded us, adjusting her shawl against the cooling evening air. "And remember what Grandfather taught you about protecting the home." Dad nodded in agreement. "Stay inside after dark. The reservation's been having trouble with trespassers lately." He didn't elaborate, but the grave look in his eyes conveyed more than words could express. We watched their taillights disappear down the dirt road, unaware that their absence would set in motion events that would forever alter our perception of reality. As darkness settled around our home, we completed our chores with practiced efficiency, falling into the comfortable routine that defined our evenings alone, then cleaned the few dishes by lamplight. My brothers joked around while I tried to relax, but I couldn't help peering at the windows. The desert night was always dark, yet that particular night felt like it was pressing against the walls. Once we finished our chores, we set the lanterns on the kitchen table and sat down. We had no television or internet, so we just chatted in low voices about the day. The air smelled of warm dust and the faint smoke left over from our wood stove. We were tired, but not quite ready to sleep. Outside, the wind whispered across the empty land. Usually that lullaby would put me at ease, but my instincts kept buzzing like an alarm. Suddenly, we heard something out by the truck. A shuffling noise that wasn't the wind. It was like someone was shifting around boxes or picking things up and dropping them. My brothers and I stared at each other, realizing nobody should be out there at that hour. The closest neighbors lived miles away, and they'd never just drop by unannounced. My oldest brother crept toward the window, letting the lantern's glow guide him. He peered through a small gap in the curtain. I watched his face go pale. That's when he whispered that someone was digging around in the truck. A tightness clenched my stomach. Why would a stranger sneak onto our property so far from town, let alone rifle through our vehicle? It didn't take long for fear to settle in. I can still remember the way my brother's hands trembled as he backed away from the window. His eyes, wide with panic, reflected the dancing lantern flame. "Someone's out there," he whispered, voice barely audible above the persistent desert wind. "They're going through Dad's truck." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. We huddled closer together, instinctively seeking protection in proximity. My younger brother, usually quick with jokes and laughter, sat frozen in his chair. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "What do they look like?" I managed to ask, though part of me dreaded the answer. My older brother shook his head. "Too dark to see clearly, just a shape moving around the cab." He swallowed hard. "But something's wrong about it. The way it moves." That hesitation, that inability to articulate what disturbed him so deeply, intensified my fear more than any detailed description could have. In that moment, I became acutely aware of our vulnerability. 3 teenagers alone in an isolated house with no means of communication, no neighbors within shouting distance, and parents who wouldn't return until morning. The sounds outside continued, metal scraping against metal, the creak of the truck's door hinge, occasional thumps that suggested items being tossed aside. Whatever was out there moved with purpose, searching for something specific. "Maybe it's just someone looking for food or supplies," my younger brother suggested, voice cracking. "They might leave if they don't find anything valuable." But even as he spoke, I sensed he didn't believe his own words. This wasn't a desperate traveler or opportunistic thief. Something about the systematic nature of the search, the boldness of approaching an occupied home, suggested a more sinister intent. My older brother moved to the corner where Dad kept his hunting rifle. The weapon had always been a silent presence in our home, necessary for protection, but rarely touched. I watched as he carefully lifted it from its mount, checking that it was loaded with trembling fingers. "We should call out," I suggested. "Let them know we're here and armed." He shook his head. "Not yet. If they're just looking to steal, they'll run when they know we've spotted them. But if they're looking for..." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. We'd all heard stories of violence on the reservation, incidents that went unreported in mainstream news but traveled through community whispers. The minutes stretched painfully as we debated our options. The intruder showed no signs of leaving, and our fear grew with each passing moment. Finally, my older brother made a decision. "We need to confront them," he said firmly. "All of us together. Show strength." We glanced around the living room, trying to figure out a plan. There wasn't exactly a phone to call for help. No landline, no cell service out here. My younger brother fumbled for the rifle we kept near the door, the one we almost never touched. He handed it to me like he couldn't stand the thought of holding it himself. I took it, feeling my hands tremble. The idea of facing down someone in the pitch-black yard made my head spin, but what choice did we have? We needed to protect our home. We decided to step out onto the porch, see if we could scare them off. My heart thumped against my chest, each beat reminding me just how alone we were. We eased open the front door. The night air rushed in, cold and full of possibilities. Lantern lights spilled over the porch steps, but it didn't reach the truck. We strained our eyes, searching for any sign of movement. For several seconds, we couldn't see anything. Just the vague outline of the vehicle and shadow stretching over the dirt yard. But there was that sound again, like metal scraping. Something was definitely out there, and it wasn't some friendly neighbor. I whispered to my brothers that we needed to stick together. The rifle felt heavier than it ever had, like it knew trouble was near. In the darkness, I thought I saw a shape move near the truck's open door. My pulse hammered. Part of me wanted to shout for whoever it was to leave. Another part worried that calling out might provoke them. We just stood there, silent, hearts pounding, trying to catch a glimpse of this unwelcome visitor who had appeared out of nowhere. And I had the strangest sense that we were being watched in return. I eased onto the porch with my brothers huddled behind me, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. The rattling sound we'd heard before had stopped, but that only made me more anxious. Even in the faint glow, I could spot the truck a few yards away. The passenger door was open wider than it had been just minutes ago. Whoever was messing with it was clearly not done. My older brother whispered for the intruder to come out and explain themselves, voice shaking despite his effort to sound tough. Silence answered back, an unsettling quiet so deep it seemed the entire desert paused to listen. Then a shape rose by the truck's open door. It turned toward the house, slow and deliberate. My stomach tightened. The figure stood unnaturally still, a darker shadow against the night. Distance and darkness obscured details, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, too thin, with angles that defied normal human anatomy. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing, automatically trying to fit this anomaly into familiar categories. "Who's there?" My older brother called out, his voice stronger than before. "This is private property." The figure remained motionless for several heartbeats, then tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if considering us from a perspective that wasn't quite right. The gesture sent waves of revulsion through me, not because of what I could see, but because of what I could sense. An overwhelming feeling of wrongness emanated from the intruder, something that transcended ordinary fear. My younger brother pressed against my back, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Something's not right," he whispered, his words barely audible. "That doesn't look like a person." I wanted to dismiss his observation, to cling to rational explanations, but the evidence before us defied reason. Normal trespassers don't stand motionless, observing their victims. They don't move with such deliberate, unnatural precision. And they certainly don't emanate the sense of ancient malevolence that radiated from this entity. Something about the way it moved stole all sense of security. I raised the rifle, bracing it against my shoulder, and said that we weren't afraid. The shape didn't react beyond standing perfectly still for a moment. The lantern's light barely reached the edge of the yard, so I could only make out an outline. Tall, maybe hunched, definitely not normal. Its stillness unnerved me more than any lunge or sudden motion could have. My brother urged me to fire a warning shot just over its head, in hopes of scaring it off. I pulled the trigger and a dull click echoed in my ears. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. Every desperate pull only produced more clicks. The rifle felt dead in my hands. I remember panicking because we'd used that gun a few times in the past, and it never had problems. Yet at that moment, it behaved as if it had no intention of defending us. The figure took a step forward. The failure of the rifle sent a surge of terror through my body. This wasn't a mechanical malfunction. The weapon had been meticulously maintained, cleaned after every use, stored properly. Dad had taught us the importance of gun care from an early age. "Your life might depend on it someday," he'd warned, words that now echoed with prophetic clarity. The entity seemed to sense our growing fear. It took another step forward, its movement fluid yet somehow disjointed, as if its limbs connected differently than human anatomy would allow. The distance between us was shrinking, and our only means of defense had failed. "Get back inside," my older brother hissed, positioning himself between us and the approaching figure. "Lock the door and block it with furniture." But retreat felt impossible, my feet frozen to the wooden planks of the porch. Running seemed futile against something that had deliberately sought us out, that had traveled miles of desert darkness to find our isolated home, and a wave of rot wafted over the porch. It smelled like something decaying in the heat, so potent it made me want to gag. My brothers backed away, alarm plain on their faces. I held the rifle up again, refusing to drop it even though it seemed useless. It was the only thing keeping me from freezing with fear. Just then, a flicker of light glimmered down the road. Through the sparse trees, I could see a pair of headlights bouncing along the dirt path. The stench overwhelmed my senses, not just decay but something deeper and more primal. It carried notes of disturbed earth, stagnant water, and something unmistakably organic yet profoundly wrong. The odor triggered instinctive revulsion, a biological warning system screaming that we faced something unnatural. My younger brother retched, doubling over as he fought to control his nausea. Even my older brother, always the strongest among us, visibly recoiled. The putrid cloud seemed to have substance, wrapping around us like tendrils of fog. The approaching headlights cut through the darkness like divine intervention. Hope surged through me, not just for rescue but for witnesses, for confirmation that what we were experiencing was real and not some shared delusion born of isolation and fear. Relief and dread warred inside me. My grandparents were home, which was good. But what if this intruder decided to target them too? The shape shifted its attention to the approaching lights and slowly peeled away from the truck. Before we could react, it slid behind one of the large, gnarled trees that dotted our property. I'd never felt such a potent mix of fury and terror. Part of me wanted to chase after it, demanding answers. The other half wanted to retreat inside, block every door, and pray that the thing wouldn't return. I heard my grandparents pull up and hop out of the car. My oldest brother raced across the yard to meet them, rifle in hand, telling them in frantic whispers about the intruder. My grandfather eyed the open truck door, then focused on the tree line. Without needing an explanation, he dashed inside, rummaged around for ashes from the stove. He coated the barrel and a single bullet, working quickly and calmly. Grandfather's immediate understanding of the situation chilled me more thoroughly than the entity itself. There was no surprise in his weathered face, no disbelief or confusion, only grim recognition. He knew what we were facing without being told, as if he'd been expecting this encounter for years. I watched in fascination as his hands moved with practiced precision, coating the rifle barrel with gray ash from our wood stove. His lips moved in silent prayer, words in Navajo too quiet for me to catch. The ritual seemed ancient, passed down through generations as protection against forces most people no longer believed in. "What is that thing?" I whispered when he returned to the porch. Grandfather's eyes met mine, filled with a weight of knowledge I couldn't comprehend. "Something that should not be here," he answered simply. "Something that has forgotten its place in the world." His cryptic response frustrated me, but I recognized the protective intent behind his vagueness. Some knowledge was dangerous to possess, some names dangerous to speak. In that moment, I understood why certain stories were only told in winter, why certain rituals were performed away from young ears. "The gun wouldn't fire," my older brother explained, voice strained with residual fear. Grandfather nodded as if this were entirely expected. "Of course not. It knows the ways of our world." He checked the ash-coated bullet, sliding it into the chamber with reverence. "But we know older ways." Like he'd practiced this before. When he came back out, we clustered around him. My grandmother stood protectively near me and my younger brother. My grandfather strode to the edge of the porch and aimed at the place where we'd last seen that shape lurking. He fired without shouting a warning, one thunderous blast that broke the suffocating stillness. For an instant, I thought he'd missed until a shrieking cry tore through the night. A shadow ripped away from the tree and tore across the yard. The inhuman scream seared itself into my memory, a sound that existed somewhere between animal pain and human rage, yet was neither. It resonated at a frequency that seemed to vibrate through bone rather than air, triggering instinctive terror at a biological level. The entity's movement as it fled was equally disturbing, not the steady gait of a person running, not the bounded leap of a four-legged animal, but something in between. Its limbs extended and contracted in impossible ways, covering ground with unnatural speed. Grandmother pulled us closer, her thin arm surprisingly strong across our shoulders. "Don't look directly at it," she warned. "It takes something from you when you witness its true form." I averted my eyes, focusing instead on grandfather's determined expression. He maintained his aim, tracking the fleeing shadow until it disappeared beyond the reach of our lantern light. Only then did he lower the rifle, his shoulders slumping slightly with released tension. "Will it come back?" my younger brother asked, voice small with lingering fear. Grandfather considered the question carefully. "Not tonight," he finally answered. "But it has marked this place now, marked all of you." He turned to face us fully, his expression grave. "There are preparations we must make." Heading farther into the desert. We didn't stop to question what it was, or how it was still moving after that shot. My grandfather and my older brother raced for the truck, engine roaring as they gave chase. I stood there, surrounded by lantern glow, trying not to let my mind wander too far into dark possibilities. The stench lingered in the air, as if whatever that thing was had left a piece of itself behind. All I could do was cling to the thought that if anybody could handle it, the sudden departure left me, my younger brother, and grandmother alone in the eerie aftermath. The night seemed to press closer without grandfather's reassuring presence, shadows deepening in corners that had never bothered me before. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind through the juniper trees took on sinister potential. Grandmother moved with purpose, retrieving items from various places around the house, a small leather pouch from beneath a floorboard, dried herbs from a kitchen cabinet, a carved wooden box I'd never seen before. She worked methodically, laying these objects on the kitchen table before retrieving a container of cornmeal from the pantry. "Don't just stand there," she instructed, her voice gentle but firm. "We have work to do before they return." She guided us through the process of creating protective symbols at each entrance, doorways, windows, even the small bathroom vent. We traced precise patterns with cornmeal while she recited prayers in Navajo, teaching us the words and correcting our pronunciation with patient insistence. "These words are your heritage," she explained as we worked. "They connect you to those who came before, who faced these same challenges and survived." My younger brother, still pale with fear, found comfort in the ritual. His hand steadied as he completed each symbol, his breathing becoming more regular. I envied his ability to surrender fully to faith, to accept protection without questioning its mechanism. My own mind raced with unanswered questions. What exactly had invaded our property? Why had it chosen our family? How could grandfather track something that moved with such unnatural speed through pitch darkness? Most disturbingly, how had he known exactly what to do, as if he'd been preparing for this specific threat? "Grandmother," I ventured as we finished the last symbol. "What is happening? Please, I need to understand." She studied my face for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. Finally, she sighed and gestured for us to sit at the kitchen table. "There are those who choose dark paths," she began, her voice low. People who trade their humanity for power, who break the most sacred taboos. Skinwalkers, my younger brother whispered, the forbidden word slipping out before he could stop himself. Grandmother's expression hardened. We do not name them, she admonished. Names have power. But yes, that is what the outside world calls them. She explained in careful terms that danced around direct statements how certain individuals corrupted traditional knowledge for personal gain, how they underwent rituals of such profound transgression that they forfeited their connection to humanity, how they gained abilities that defied natural law, but lost their souls in the process. But why us? I pressed, needing to understand our role in this nightmare. Your grandfather refused to look away when others chose blindness, she answered simply. Some in our community prefer peace at any price, even if that price is silent complicity. This revelation opened a new dimension of understanding about my grandfather. Not just a traditional man living by old ways, but a deliberate guardian standing against forces others preferred to ignore. His occasional unexplained absences, his insistence on teaching us certain protective rituals, his watchfulness during certain phases of the moon, all took on new significance. Our conversation ended abruptly as headlights swept across the kitchen window. Grandfather's truck had returned. It was my grandfather. He'd clearly known something about dusting the rifle in ashes, a trick I'd never heard of before. Still, that encounter had rattled us. We weren't prepared for how close danger had come or how little we could do about it. And even though the worst part seemed over, I couldn't shake the notion that the fight was only just beginning. Grandfather and my older brother didn't hesitate after that shot rang out. They jumped into the truck and tore off into the desert, leaving me, my other brother, and grandmother huddled on the porch. My thoughts kept spinning as the taillights blinked across the uneven ground. Part of me wished I could have gone with them, though my legs felt too unsteady to stand. I was stuck there, hoping they wouldn't be lured somewhere even worse in that darkness. It felt like ages before we heard the engines roar again, faint at first, then growing louder as it rolled back toward the house. When the truck finally crested the rise, Grandfather slammed on the brakes. The tires kicked up a cloud of dust that lingered, and in the shifting beams of the headlights, I saw my older brother's stunned face. They both climbed out, eyes full of the kind of urgency that meant no one was getting any rest tonight. Grandfather told us how they chased the figure beyond a steep ditch that dropped off at least 20 feet. He slammed on the brakes in time to avoid tumbling over the edge. My older brother's hands trembled as he described what they'd witnessed. His voice kept breaking, forcing him to stop and collect himself before continuing. The confident teenager I'd known my entire life had been replaced by someone fundamentally shaken. It wasn't running like a person, he explained, gesturing with jerky movements. More like crawling fast, but not on hands and knees. The joints were all wrong. Grandfather nodded gravely. What you saw was not its true form, he explained. It shifts between shapes, never fully human, never fully animal. The transition is what you witnessed. The clinical detachment in his voice suggested intimate knowledge of these entities, not second-hand information from stories, but personal experience. I wondered how many times he had faced such threats without ever speaking of them to us. Then he leapt out to confront it. My brother swore that each time the headlights caught the runner, it flickered into the shape of a woman loping on all fours, her limbs bending in ways that defied reason. At the brink of that ditch, Grandfather shouted in Navajo, naming a local woman he suspected was behind this evil. He demanded she leave us in peace, warning she'd pay if she persisted. They saw it pause, like it understood every syllable. This revelation, that the horror we faced had a human origin, an identity known to Grandfather, somehow made everything more terrifying. Not a nameless, ancient evil, but someone who lived among us, who might have smiled and nodded to us at community gatherings. "How did you know?" I asked, struggling to reconcile this information with my understanding of our small community. Grandfather's expression darkened. "There have been signs. Livestock found mutilated in specific ways, strange tracks around homes where children have fallen ill, whispers of someone seen in places they couldn't possibly be." He had been investigating these incidents quietly, gathering evidence while others dismissed them as coyote attacks or coincidence. The confrontation tonight confirmed his suspicions about who was responsible. "Naming her was dangerous," Grandmother interjected, concern evident in her voice. "You've tied your spirit to hers now." Grandfather nodded solemnly. "It was necessary. The boundary has been drawn." He turned to us, his gaze intense. "Now we prepare. She will not forgive being exposed." The realization that our family had become entangled in something so much larger and more dangerous than a simple trespassing incident settled heavily upon me. This wasn't over. It was merely beginning. Then it released a guttural hiss and bolted deeper into the desert. Even with the rifle loaded properly, hitting a figure so fast in the dead of night was nearly impossible. Not wanting to risk a rollover or get led into unfamiliar terrain, Grandfather made the call to turn back. The realization that it was far too cunning to corner made everything feel worse. We locked up the house as best we could, blocking the doors and pulling the curtains. My brothers and I sat around the lantern, each of us jumping at the slightest rustle. Grandmother said a prayer in a trembling voice, hands pressed together. Meanwhile, Grandfather kept that ash-coated rifle at his side, keeping watch at a window. I could see the weight of the night in his posture, determined but exhausted. No one slept until dawn. Every creak set us on edge, hearts pounding as we wondered if that thing had decided to return. The tension in that long night transformed our understanding of darkness. Shadows weren't just absence of light anymore. They were potential vessels for malevolence. Each corner of our familiar home became suspect, each unexpected sound a possible harbinger of return. Grandmother kept us busy with protective measures, teaching us prayers and rituals that had been passed down through generations. My younger brother embraced these teachings with newfound reverence, finding comfort in tradition that had previously seemed irrelevant to modern life. My older brother remained vigilant, positioned near Grandfather at the window, absorbing whatever knowledge the old man shared in hushed Navajo. Their conversation excluded me, not deliberately, but through my limited grasp of our ancestral language, a deficiency I now regretted deeply. I occupied the uncomfortable middle ground, too rational to surrender completely to traditional beliefs, yet too shaken by what I'd witnessed to dismiss them. The entity had been undeniably real, its presence confirmed by everyone present. Yet it defied the natural laws I'd been taught in school, existing in a realm where science offered no protection. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness, pale light gradually revealing the familiar landscape of our property. The mundane reality of juniper trees, weathered fence posts, and distant mesas stood in stark contrast to the nightmare of the previous night. In the first gray light of morning, we ventured out. The sickly sweet stench had faded, but muddy footprints remained by the truck. None of them looked like a neat pair of shoes. The prints were splayed with deep indentations that reminded me of paw marks more than anything human. Over the next few days, our whole household operated like we were on constant alert. A few neighbors dropped by, hearing whispers that our family had crossed paths with something foul. The footprints defied explanation. Too large for coyote or wolf, yet not matching any human shoe pattern. They began normally near the truck, but gradually elongated and distorted as they tracked across the yard, becoming increasingly animalistic before disappearing altogether near the property boundary. Grandfather photographed them with an old Polaroid camera before carefully erasing each print with a mixture of ash and salt. He worked methodically, murmuring prayers over each one before moving to the next. The ritual took most of the morning, leaving him visibly drained. News traveled quickly through the small community. Neighbors arrived throughout the day, ostensibly bringing food or offering help with chores, but their curious glances and hushed conversations revealed their true purpose. They wanted confirmation of rumors already circulating, that the old threats were active again, that traditional protections were necessary once more. Some expressed skepticism, attributing our experience to overactive imagination or misidentification of an ordinary trespasser. Others shared their own encounters in hushed tones, stories they had previously kept hidden for fear of ridicule or concern about attracting unwanted attention. We tried to make light of it, but people exchanged grave looks, each recalling stories of their own strange encounters. Then we heard the news. The same local woman grandfather had named that night passed away under mysterious circumstances. Nobody could explain exactly what happened. Some said she fell ill suddenly. Others blamed old age. But the timing left us uneasy. It was grandfather's silence that told me everything. He insisted we show respect. The woman's passing sent ripples of unease through the community. She had been a reclusive figure, living alone on the outskirts of the reservation in a house rarely visited by neighbors. Few attended her funeral, but those who did reported strange phenomena, unexplained cold spots, electronic devices failing, a persistent sense of being watched. Grandfather maintained strict silence regarding any connection between our experience and her death. When pressed, he would only say, "What returns to the earth belongs to the earth now. Let the dead rest." But I noticed new protective measures appearing around our property. Bundles of herbs hanging from eaves, complex symbols carved into fence posts, strands of horsehair strung across certain windows. The incident marked a turning point in my relationship with my heritage. The traditional knowledge I had previously viewed as quaint stories for children revealed itself as a sophisticated system for navigating threats beyond modern understanding. My education in tribal ways intensified, no longer casual lessons but urgent transmission of survival knowledge. Keep our heads down and remain cautious. He refused to talk further about the woman's passing, but I glimpsed the relief etched on his face. From what I'd heard around the reservation, if you call out a skinwalker, if you speak their name, you're essentially dooming them. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe grandfather's act of naming her truly sealed her fate. Whatever the explanation, the stench and the footprints vanished. Our dogs barked less. In the months that followed, life gradually returned to normal rhythms, but with subtle differences. Our family's vigilance never fully relaxed. New routines incorporated protective practices that became second nature. Checking for tracks each morning, maintaining small offerings at property boundaries, observing certain taboos regarding discussion of specific topics after sunset. The experience changed us individually as well. My younger brother embraced traditional ways completely, apprenticing himself to grandfather and other tribal elders. My older brother became more protective, eventually pursuing a career in tribal law enforcement. And I found myself drawn to documenting and preserving our stories, recognizing that what seemed like superstition to outsiders often contained vital truths encoded in metaphor and symbolism. Years have passed since that night, and I've witnessed similar encounters throughout the reservation, enough to confirm that our experience wasn't isolated or unique. Some skeptics attribute these phenomena to mass hysteria, psychological projection, or misidentification of natural animals. Others point to environmental contaminants, poverty-induced stress, or internalized cultural trauma as explanations, as territory had been reclaimed by friendlier spirits. Nights felt a little safer, though the rifle still leaned by the front door. Ashes kept close at hand. The memory of that figure's slow advance, and the way the gun wouldn't fire, stuck with me longer than anything else. Even now, whenever shadows move weirdly after dusk, I remember that night. Some folks think these tales are nothing but superstition. I understand the impulse to rationalize, to seek explanations that fit within comfortable paradigms. Before that night, I might have done the same. But having witnessed something that violated natural law, having seen multiple rational people confirm the same inexplicable phenomena, I can no longer dismiss these experiences so easily. The world contains more layers than modern society acknowledges, more possibilities than science has catalogued. The boundaries between known and unknown, natural and supernatural, remain more permeable than most people realize. I don't expect others to believe without experiencing for themselves. Skepticism is healthy, especially regarding phenomena that defy conventional explanation. But I would caution against dismissing traditional knowledge simply because it doesn't align with current understanding. Our ancestors developed sophisticated systems for navigating threats they encountered repeatedly over generations. But I lived through one too many coincidences to dismiss them. Maybe the woman was just a person who knew dark tricks, or maybe she truly turned into something not quite human. Either way, I learned that in the isolation of our land, there are forces you don't challenge unless you're ready to face the consequences. By the time my parents returned to their routine of chapter house visits, I'd grown used to being on guard. The chills from that encounter never fully went away. But I found a strange comfort in knowing we survived it. We held our ground. That was enough. And on those quiet nights when the moon's out and the wind rustles the dry brush, I remind myself that evil's real, but so is resilience. Our family proved that much. Summer 2019 stretched endlessly before me like a wasteland of boredom. At 17, I found myself trapped in that awkward space between childhood and adulthood, watching my friends scatter to their various family vacations while I remained stranded at home. The silence in our house became oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioner and my mother's increasingly concerned glances as I spent another day sprawled on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone. After 2 weeks of my theatrical sighs and dramatic declarations about dying of boredom, my mother finally snapped. "That's it," she announced, bursting into my room with a determined expression that I'd learned to fear. "You're going to camp." I protested immediately. "Mom, I'm 17. Camp is for kids." "Not this camp," she said, pulling out a glossy brochure. "Pine Ridge Adventure Camp. Ages 16-18. It's perfect." I examined the brochure with growing dread. Photos of smiling teenagers engaged in various outdoor activities stared back at me mockingly. Rock climbing, hiking, campfires, swimming in murky lakes, everything I despised about the great outdoors. I'd had my heart set on the computer programming camp downtown, but those spots had filled up months ago. "I'd rather code than catch fish," I muttered, but my mother was already reaching for her phone to call the registration number. 3 days later, I stood in my bedroom, reluctantly stuffing clothes into a duffel bag while my mother rattled off a checklist. Sunscreen, bug spray, extra socks, flashlight. Each item felt like another link in the chain dragging me away from civilization. The drive to Pine Ridge took exactly 1 hour and 14 minutes. I counted every excruciating minute. The landscape gradually shifted from suburban neighborhoods to increasingly dense forests. The trees seemed to press closer to the road with each passing mile, their branches creating a canopy so thick that the afternoon sun barely penetrated through. When we finally arrived at the camp entrance, I felt my stomach drop. The wooden sign, weathered and slightly tilted, read Pine Ridge Adventure Camp S 1987 in faded letters. Below it, smaller text warned, "Proceed at your own risk." My mother laughed it off as a joke, but something about those words sent an uncomfortable sensation crawling up my spine. A man emerged from a small cabin near the entrance, his weathered face splitting into what I assumed was meant to be a welcoming smile. He was tall and lean, with the kind of deep tan that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His eyes were a pale blue, almost colorless, and when he looked at me, I felt like he was seeing something I couldn't quite understand. "You must be our new camper," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Roger, but everyone here calls me Buzzy. Been running this place for about 15 years now." My mother shook his hand enthusiastically, launching into that embarrassing parental routine of sharing too much information about their child. "He's been so bored this summer, haven't you, honey? This will be perfect for him. Fresh air, new friends, adventures." Buzzy nodded along, but I noticed his eyes kept drifting back to me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When my mother finally finished her monologue, he said, "Well, let's get you settled in. Your cabin mates are already here." The walk to my assigned cabin took us along a winding dirt path through towering pine trees. The air was thick with humidity and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. Other campers moved about the grounds, but something felt off about the whole scene. Their conversations seemed forced, their laughter a little too loud, as if they were all performing rather than genuinely enjoying themselves. "Here we are," Buzzy announced, stopping in front of a small log cabin that looked like it hadn't been updated since the camp's founding. "Cabin 7. You'll be sharing with 3 other campers." He pushed open the creaky door, revealing a cramped interior with 2 sets of bunk beds positioned against opposite walls. The smell hit me immediately. A mixture of old wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant. 3 girls looked up as we entered. The first, a redhead with freckles scattered across her nose, was perched on the top bunk reading a well-worn paperback. The second, a brunette with nervous energy, was organizing her belongings at a small table in the corner. The third, blonde and athletic-looking, was lying on the bottom bunk, staring at the ceiling. "Girls, meet your new cabin mate," Buzzy said with that same unsettling smile. "This is our new addition to the Pine Ridge family." The redhead climbed down from her bunk and extended her hand. "I'm Zoe," she said warmly. "That's Madison over there organizing her life away, and the quiet one is Brooke." Madison waved from her table while Brooke simply nodded without looking over. I introduced myself, feeling slightly more hopeful about my week ahead. At least my cabin mates seemed normal enough. After my mother left with promises to pick me up in exactly 7 days, Buzzy showed me to my assigned space, the top bunk in the left corner. The mattress was thin and lumpy, and when I sat down, the entire bed frame creaked ominously. A small window was positioned directly above my pillow, offering a view of the dense forest beyond. The first day passed in a blur of orientation activities, camp rules, and meet-and-greet sessions. Dinner was served in a large dining hall filled with roughly 150 other campers, all seated at long wooden tables that bore the scars of decades of use. The food was standard camp fare: overcooked hamburgers, soggy fries, and juice that tasted like it had been mixed with lake water. As evening approached, we gathered around a massive fire pit for what Buzzy called our Pine Ridge tradition. The flames cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled campers, and for the first time since arriving, I felt a genuine sense of camaraderie as we sang songs and roasted marshmallows. But even in that moment of normalcy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line. Several times I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there except the impenetrable darkness between the trees. Back in Cabin 7, my bunkmates and I settled into our respective sleeping arrangements. I had secretly brought my iPod, despite the camp's policy against electronic devices, and I plugged in my earbuds to listen to music as I tried to fall asleep. The familiar melodies helped drown out the unsettling sounds of the forest, the constant rustling of leaves, the distant calls of night birds, and the occasional crack of a breaking branch. At exactly 1 a.m., my iPod suddenly erupted with a shrill alarm sound that cut through my headphones like a knife. I jolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs, and frantically fumbled to silence the device. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin, and I held my breath, waiting for one of my roommates to stir. Strangely, none of them moved. Zoe continued breathing steadily on the bunk across from me. Madison remained motionless at her table where she'd apparently fallen asleep over her book, and Brooke showed no signs of having heard anything at all. I stared at my iPod in confusion. I hadn't set any alarms, and the device had been on silent mode when I'd gone to sleep. The screen showed no indication of any scheduled alerts, yet the alarm had definitely gone off. Shaken but trying to rationalize the incident, I settled back onto my pillow and was about to close my eyes when something compelled me to look out the small window above my bed. The glass was fogged with condensation from the cool night air, creating a hazy barrier between the cabin's interior and the forest beyond. I wiped away the moisture with my sleeve, and what I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. Two small, intensely red points of light were staring back at me from the darkness outside. They weren't moving, weren't blinking, just fixed on my location with an unwavering focus that made my skin crawl. The rational part of my mind tried to explain them away. Reflections from some distant light source, perhaps, or the eyes of a nocturnal animal caught in the moonlight. But these weren't natural. They pulsed with a malevolent energy that seemed to penetrate straight through the glass and into my soul. I wanted to scream, to wake my cabin mates, to run from the room, but my body refused to respond. My muscles had locked up completely, leaving me trapped in a state of paralyzed terror. The red lights seemed to grow brighter, more intense, as if they were feeding off my fear. Time became meaningless. I might have been staring at those eyes for seconds or hours. My perception had become completely distorted. The rest of the world had ceased to exist, narrowing down to just me and whatever was watching me from the forest. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. No gradual dimming, no movement away from the window. They simply ceased to exist, as if they had never been there at all. I remained frozen for several more minutes, my eyes darting frantically across the window's surface, searching for any sign of the watcher's return. When I finally managed to convince myself that it was gone, I rolled over and buried my face in my pillow, pulling the thin camp blanket over my head despite the warm night air. Sleep eventually claimed me, but it was a restless, nightmare-filled slumber that provided no real rest. I dreamed of red eyes floating through the darkness, of shadows that moved independently of their sources, and of voices whispering words I couldn't quite understand, but knew were meant for me. At exactly 2 a.m., my iPod screamed to life again. This time, I was ready for it, and I silenced the device within seconds. But the damage was done. I was wide awake, every nerve in my body crackling with tension. Remembering the horror of the previous night's window encounter, I made a conscious decision to keep my face pressed firmly into my mattress. I wouldn't look outside. I wouldn't give whatever was out there the satisfaction of seeing my fear again. But this time, the window wasn't the source of my terror. The mattress beneath me suddenly dipped, as if someone had climbed onto the bed. The springs creaked softly under the additional weight, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of another body settling in beside me. The presence was wrong in every conceivable way. Too cold, too heavy, emanating an aura of malevolence that made my skin crawl. A hand, or what felt like a hand, pressed against my back through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. The contact was ice cold and seemed to leach warmth from my body wherever it touched. I began to shake uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face as I pressed my mouth against the pillow to muffle any sounds that might escape. The thing, because I could no longer convince myself it was human, leaned closer to my ear. Its breath was like winter air, carrying the scent of decay and something else I couldn't identify but instinctively knew was wrong. Then it spoke, and the words burned themselves into my memory with a clarity that would haunt me for years to come. "No one can help you here." The voice was human in structure but utterly inhuman in tone. It carried layers of malice and amusement, as if my terror was the most entertaining thing it had experienced in ages. Following the words came a sound that defied description, not quite laughter, not quite snarl, but something that bypassed my rational mind and triggered every primitive fear response in my body. The weight lifted from my bed as suddenly as it had appeared, but I remained motionless, too terrified to move, too afraid to open my eyes. I lay there trembling until exhaustion finally overcame fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The following morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, birds chirped in the trees, and my cabin mates went about their morning routines as if nothing had happened. I said nothing about my nocturnal encounters, partly because I doubted anyone would believe me, and partly because voicing the experience would make it more real than I was prepared to handle. Throughout the day's activities, a nature hike, swimming in the lake, arts and crafts, I felt disconnected from everything around me. My responses to questions were mechanical, my participation half-hearted. Zoe asked several times if I was feeling okay, but I deflected her concerns with vague mentions of poor sleep. During our return from the afternoon hike, I noticed something that made my steps falter. In the soft dirt beside our cabin's entrance, there were footprints. But these weren't human footprints. They were longer, narrower, with what appeared to be claw marks at the ends of each toe. The prints were deep, suggesting whatever made them was considerably heavier than a normal person. I called Buzzy over, pointing to the strange marks in the dirt. His reaction was telling. Instead of surprise or confusion, his face showed a flash of something that looked almost like recognition before he quickly masked it with concern. He said, crouching down to examine the prints more closely. Can't say I recognize these exactly, but we get all sorts of wildlife around here. Probably just a bear or large dog passing through. But I'd seen bear prints before during a family camping trip years earlier, and these were nothing like those. These were something else entirely. Something that walked upright but wasn't human. Have you seen prints like these before? I asked, studying his face for any hint of deception. Buzzy straightened up, avoiding my eyes. Can't say that I have, he lied smoothly. But like I said, lots of critters in these woods. Nothing to worry about. His dismissal felt forced, and I noticed how quickly he ushered me away from the area. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Whatever was happening to me, Buzzy knew more about it than he was letting on. That night, I lay in my bunk with every muscle tensed, dreading the arrival of 1 a.m. I had considered asking to sleep in the main lodge or requesting a transfer to a different cabin, but how could I explain my reasoning without sounding completely insane? The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I listened to the quiet sounds of my cabin mates sleeping, to the settling of the old wooden structure, to the endless symphony of night sounds from the forest beyond our walls. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the trees, every distant animal call made me flinch. At exactly 1 a.m., my iPod erupted with its mysterious alarm. I silenced it immediately, but the damage was done. The nightly ritual had begun. This time, I was determined to understand what was happening to me. Instead of hiding under my blanket, I forced myself to remain alert and observant. I heard the soft creak of the cabin door opening, followed by a sound that made my skin crawl. A wet, sliding noise, like something being dragged across the wooden floor. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, pausing near each bunk as if examining the sleeping occupants. When it stopped beside my ladder, I had to bite my tongue to keep from making any sound that might draw its attention. After what felt like an eternity, the sliding sound moved away, and I heard the door creak shut. I waited several more minutes before allowing myself to breathe normally again. But my relief was short-lived. At 2 a.m., the alarm sounded again, and this time I felt the familiar depression of the mattress as something climbed into bed with me. The routine was becoming horribly predictable, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was visiting me was establishing a pattern, a ritual that I was powerless to break. The cold hand pressed against my back again, and the voice whispered new words that chilled me to the bone. You can't leave. You belong here now. The next morning brought a horrifying discovery. Madison was shaking me awake, her face pale with terror. You need to see this, she whispered urgently. I climbed down from my bunk and followed her gaze to the floor beside my ladder. There, in the wooden boards, were more of the strange footprints, but these weren't in dirt or sand. They were burned into the wood itself, as if whatever made them had been hot enough to leave permanent marks. Brooke was standing in the corner, her face white as a sheet. I saw it, she said quietly. Last night, I woke up and saw something climbing up to your bunk. What did it look like? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I couldn't see it clearly. It was like a shadow, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving in ways that didn't make sense. And its eyes? She shuddered. They were red, like someone had lit coals in its skull. Zoe joined us, and together we stared at the burned footprints. We need to tell Buzzy, she said. But something in her voice suggested she already knew it wouldn't help. When Buzzy arrived and saw the evidence, his mask of ignorance finally slipped. I saw resignation in his eyes, and something that might have been guilt. How long has this been going on? I demanded. He sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older than his years. Pine Ridge isn't like other camps, he admitted. We cater to a specific type of camper. Those who have had encounters, who have been marked by things that most people refuse to acknowledge exist. What are you talking about? Madison asked. But I was beginning to understand. The things that visit you here, Buzzy continued. They're drawn to certain individuals. People who can see beyond the normal world, who have thin barriers between themselves and other things. We try to help campers learn to cope with their gifts, but sometimes what? I pressed. Sometimes they decide they want to keep someone permanently. The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a traditional summer camp. It was some kind of supernatural halfway house, a place where people like me were brought to deal with otherworldly encounters. And now something from beyond had decided it wanted to claim me as its own. As if summoned by our conversation, my iPod suddenly activated, displaying a message I had never seen before. You cannot leave. You are mine now. I grabbed my belongings and ran from the cabin, my cabin mates close behind. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where I used a payphone to call my mother for immediate pickup. She arrived within an hour, confused and concerned by my panicked state. I never told her the full truth about what happened at Pine Ridge Adventure Camp, and I never saw Buzzy or my cabin mates again. But sometimes, in the depths of night, I still hear that terrible alarm sound, and sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I catch glimpses of red eyes watching me from the shadows, waiting patiently for the day when I'll be ready to return to the place where I truly belong. The burned footprints in that cabin floor were just the beginning. What marked me at Pine Ridge follows me still, a constant reminder that some summer camps have secrets far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The ghosts of summer linger longest in places where they shouldn't. In the deep woods of the Meskwaki Reservation, where the canopy grows so thick that noon feels like dusk, those ghosts whisper through pine needles and scrape against bark with fingernails made of wind. I should have listened to them that summer of 2015. I should have turned back when the forest first went quiet. My name is Marcus, and I've spent most of my 32 years chasing the wild places that civilization forgot. There's something about untouched wilderness that calls to people like me, something primal and honest that you can't find in the manicured parks where families spread their picnic blankets. Real wilderness doesn't care if you live or die. It doesn't pretend to be safe. That honesty had always appealed to me until the day I learned that some honest things are better left alone. I'd been friends with Joseph Whitecrow since college, where we'd bonded over our shared love of backcountry hiking and primitive camping. Joe was Meskwaki, what outsiders sometimes call Fox Tribe, and he'd grown up on the settlement in central Iowa. Unlike most tribal lands, theirs was never officially a reservation. His ancestors had bought the land back in the 1850s, making it sovereign territory that belonged entirely to his people. That distinction mattered more than I understood at the time. Joe had been inviting me to explore his family's land for years, but work and life kept getting in the way. When I finally took him up on the offer that July, I thought I was getting a special privilege, access to thousands of acres that most outsiders would never see. The settlement covered nearly 4,000 acres of rolling hills, dense forest, and winding creeks. Much of it remained untouched because, as Joe explained, his people preferred to leave certain areas undisturbed. "There are places we just don't go," he'd told me as we loaded our packs that first morning. "Not because they're dangerous in any way you'd understand, but because some ground is meant to stay sacred." I'd nodded and agreed, the way you do when someone shares their cultural beliefs. I respected Joe's traditions, even if I didn't fully grasp their significance. Looking back, I realized that my casual acceptance revealed exactly the kind of ignorance that can get you killed in places where old knowledge still matters. Joe's uncle David had joined us for that first expedition. David was in his 50s, a man who moved through the forest like he'd been born there. He spoke in a mixture of English and Meskwaki, often translating concepts that didn't exist in one language or the other. While Joe had grown up partially in both worlds, David was firmly rooted in the old ways. He carried tobacco in a beaded pouch and offered prayers before we entered certain areas of the woods. "The land remembers everything," David had explained as we paused at the edge of a particularly dense section of forest. "Every step, every intention, every transgression. Some memories run deeper than others." That first trip had been incredible. We'd seen more wildlife in 3 days than I typically encountered in a month of regular hiking. Black bears ambled through clearings with their cubs, seemingly unconcerned by our presence. Deer grazed within yards of our camp, lifting their heads to regard us with curious rather than fearful eyes. At night, the symphony of owls, coyotes, and smaller nocturnal creatures created a soundscape that felt ancient and alive. The forest felt different here than in state parks or national forests. There was a weight to it, a presence that seemed to watch from behind every tree. Not malevolent exactly, but certainly aware. David noticed me noticing. "You feel it," he said on our second night as we sat around a small fire. "The land is alive here in ways it isn't in other places. Your people," he gestured vaguely toward me, "they tend to think of wilderness as empty space waiting to be filled. We know it's already full." I'd wanted to ask what it was full of, but something in David's expression suggested that question might not be welcome. Instead, I'd listened to the night sounds and tried to identify what made this place feel so different from every other forest I'd explored. By the third day, I was completely hooked. When Joe suggested we plan a longer expedition to explore some of the more remote areas, I jumped at the chance. We started planning immediately, poring over topographical maps and discussing routes that would take us deeper into the heart of the settlement than either of us had ever been. "There are areas even I haven't seen," Joe admitted as we traced potential paths with our fingers. "Family has stories about places back in the deepest parts, but most of us stick to the areas closer to the settlement proper." "What kind of stories?" I asked. Joe glanced toward his uncle, who was preparing tobacco for an evening prayer. "Old stories, the kind that are hard to explain to outsiders." David looked up from his preparations. stories about why certain boundaries exist, why some paths should not be followed. I felt a small chill despite the warm evening air. Are we talking about dangerous terrain? Unstable ground? Not that kind of danger, David said. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words. There are places where the old spirits still walk, places where the veil between worlds is thin. Our grandparents knew to avoid these areas, but that knowledge, it doesn't always pass down the way it should. He stood and walked to the edge of our campsite, offering his tobacco to the four directions while speaking in Meskwaki. When he returned, his expression was serious. If you truly want to explore the deep places, you need to understand that you'll be entering areas where different rules apply. Our rules. You'll need to listen when we tell you to do something, even if it doesn't make sense to you. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was agreeing to. The rational part of my mind dismissed talk of spirits and thin veils as cultural mythology. Interesting from an anthropological perspective, but not something I needed to worry about practically. The deeper part of me, the part that had felt the forest watching, wasn't quite so sure. We spent the rest of that evening planning our route for what would be a 4-day expedition into the most remote section of the settlement. Joe's maps showed an area of unbroken forest that stretched for miles, crossed by several creeks and dotted with small clearings. No trails were marked in that section. We'd be navigating by compass and topographical features alone. It'll be true wilderness travel, Joe said with excitement. The kind of exploration you can't do anywhere else anymore. As we packed our gear the next morning, David pulled me aside. His expression was more serious than I'd seen it. The deep woods are not like the places you've hiked before, he said quietly. If something feels wrong, if the forest goes quiet when it shouldn't, if you hear voices calling from places where no one should be, you listen to that feeling. And you listen to us. I assured him I would, though I wondered what exactly he thought we might encounter. Bears were the only real danger I could imagine, and I'd been in bear country plenty of times before. David studied my face for a moment, then shook his head slightly. I hope your confidence is enough, he said. But confidence without wisdom can be dangerous in places where the old stories are still true. As we shouldered our packs and headed toward the deeper forest, I felt that familiar excitement that comes with exploring truly unknown territory. I had no way of knowing that within days, I'd understand exactly what David had been trying to warn me about, or that the old stories he'd mentioned would prove to be far more than mere cultural mythology. The ghosts of summer were waiting for us in those deep woods, and they were hungry for something I wasn't prepared to give. The morning we set out for the remote areas dawned clear and hot, with the kind of humid stillness that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've walked 100 yards. Joe had recruited his cousin Robert to join us, a quiet man in his late 20s who worked as a wildlife biologist for the tribal government. Robert knew the outer boundaries of the settlement's wilderness areas better than anyone, which would be crucial for navigation in a region with no established trails. Most people think wilderness navigation is about following your compass, Robert explained as we checked our gear one final time. But real navigation is about reading the land itself. Every ridge, every creek bend, every change in vegetation tells a story about where you are and where you're going. We started our hike on one of the settlement's few maintained trails, a path that wound through mixed hardwood forest, before gradually transitioning to the deeper pine and oak woods that dominated the remote areas. The transition was subtle but noticeable. The undergrowth became denser, the trees larger and more closely spaced, and the quality of light filtering through the canopy took on a green-gold tint that spoke of true old growth. For the first few hours, the hiking was pleasant if challenging. We crossed several creeks on fallen logs or by boulder hopping, each crossing taking us further from any possibility of outside contact. Robert pointed out subtle signs of wildlife, scratches on trees where bears had marked territory, patches of disturbed earth where wild turkeys had been scratching for insects, the remains of a deer kill that had been cleaned by scavengers weeks earlier. The ecosystem here is intact in ways you don't find in most places, he explained as we paused for water beside a particularly clear creek. When the boundaries are respected, when the balance is maintained, everything thrives. I was about to ask what he meant by boundaries when Joe held up a hand for silence. We all froze, listening. In the distance, we could hear the crash of something large moving through the underbrush, probably a deer startled by our presence, though it was impossible to be sure. Black bear, maybe, Robert said quietly. They're active during the day when it's this hot, looking for water. We waited several minutes before continuing, giving whatever it was time to move away from our intended route. As we hiked, I noticed that both Joe and Robert seemed more alert than they had been earlier in the day. They paused frequently to listen and occasionally exchanged words in Meskwaki that they didn't translate for my benefit. By late afternoon, we'd covered nearly 8 miles and were well into the heart of the remote area. The forest here felt different from anything I'd experienced before. The trees were massive, white oaks and black walnuts that must have been growing for centuries. The understory was relatively open, creating cathedral-like spaces between the enormous trunks. Most striking was the silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, but a quality of quietness that seemed to muffle even our footsteps and breathing. "We'll make camp up ahead," Joe said, pointing toward a small clearing visible through the trees. "There's a good water source, and the ground is level." As we approached the clearing, Robert suddenly stopped and held up his hand again. This time, his expression was different. Not just alert, but concerned. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer immediately, instead turning his head slowly as if trying to locate the source of something only he could perceive. Finally, he spoke in Meskwaki to Joe, who responded with what sounded like a question. They had a brief, hushed conversation before Joe turned to me. "Robert says the forest feels heavy here, more than it should." "Heavy how?" Robert answered directly this time. "Like there's a presence watching, like we're not alone in the way we should be alone." I looked around the clearing, which appeared completely normal to me. The early evening light slanted through the trees in golden shafts, illuminating a space that would make a perfect campsite. A small creek babbled along one edge, and the ground was carpeted with soft pine needles. If anything, it looked inviting. "Maybe we should camp somewhere else," Joe suggested, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Robert shook his head. "No, this is the right place according to our route. And running from feelings isn't always the answer. But we need to be respectful. Careful." We set up camp with more ritual than I was used to. Robert offered tobacco at each corner of our campsite while speaking in Meskwaki. Joe explained that he was asking permission to stay, letting any spirits in the area know that we came with good intentions and would leave no trace of our presence. "Your ancestors probably did something similar," Joe said as we watched Robert complete his circuit. "Most indigenous cultures understand that camping isn't just about finding good ground. It's about entering into relationship with the place." As darkness fell, the strange quality of silence I'd noticed earlier became more pronounced. Normally, a forest at night is full of sounds. Owls calling, small animals rustling through the underbrush, the distant yip of coyotes. Here, those sounds felt muted, as if they were coming from very far away or through some kind of barrier. "Is it always this quiet here?" I asked as we sat around our small fire. Joe and Robert exchanged another look. "No," Robert said simply. "Usually there's more life, more sound." "What do you think it means?" "Could be a lot of things," Joe said, but his tone suggested he suspected something specific. "Weather changes can affect animal behavior. So can the presence of predators. Or other things." Robert added quietly. We turned in early, each of us retreating to our own thoughts along with our sleeping bags. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the strange quiet and trying to identify what exactly felt wrong about it. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke sometime in the small hours of the morning to absolute silence. Not the muffled quiet of earlier, but a complete absence of sound that felt unnatural and oppressive. I lay still, straining to hear something, anything, that would indicate the normal life of a forest at night. Nothing. After several minutes, I heard movement from one of the other sleeping bags. Joe's voice came as a barely audible whisper. "You awake?" "Yeah, something's wrong. Robert's been up for an hour, says he can't shake the feeling that we're being watched." I unzipped my bag as quietly as possible and crawled toward where Robert was sitting at the edge of our camp, staring into the darkness beyond our dying fire. "How long has it been this quiet?" I whispered. "About 2 hours," he replied without taking his eyes off the tree line. "It's like every living thing for miles just stopped existing." We sat in silence for several more minutes before Joe joined us. None of us spoke for what felt like a very long time. Finally, Robert stood and began gathering his things. "We need to move camp," he said quietly. "This isn't normal, and it's not safe." "It's the middle of the night," I protested. "How can we navigate in the dark?" "Better than staying here," Joe said, already rolling up his sleeping bag. "Robert knows what he's talking about." It took us less than 30 minutes to break camp and shoulder our packs. Robert led us by moonlight through the forest, moving with a confidence that amazed me given the difficult terrain and lack of visibility. We walked for nearly 2 hours before he finally called a halt in another small clearing, this one bisected by a larger creek. "Here," he said simply. "This feels right." As if to confirm his assessment, the normal sounds of a forest at night gradually began to return as we set up our second camp. Owls called from the darkness. Something small rustled through the undergrowth nearby, and the creek provided a constant, reassuring murmur of moving water. "What was that about?" I asked once we were settled again. Robert was quiet for a long moment. "There are places in these woods where the old spirits still walk," he said finally. "Places where the boundary between worlds is thin. Most of the time, they don't pay attention to people passing through. But sometimes..." "Sometimes what?" "Sometimes they do pay attention. And when that happens, it's better to be somewhere else." I wanted to ask more questions, but something in Robert's tone suggested the conversation was over. As I settled back into my sleeping bag, I found myself wondering what exactly we'd encountered back in that first clearing, and whether it was still watching us from the darkness. The forest around our new camp remained alive with sound throughout the rest of the night, and I eventually managed to fall back asleep. But my dreams were filled with the memory of that absolute silence, and the feeling that something vast and hungry had been considering us from the darkness just beyond our fire's light. When morning came, I was almost surprised to find that the world looked normal again. Dawn broke gray and humid, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the forest canopy like a wool blanket. We'd all slept poorly after our midnight relocation, and breakfast was a subdued affair of instant coffee and energy bars eaten without much conversation. The events of the previous night felt surreal in daylight, easy to rationalize as overreaction to unfamiliar surroundings. "So, what's the plan for today?" I asked as we studied Robert's topographical maps. "There's an area about 5 miles northeast that none of us have ever explored," Joe said, pointing to a section of the map marked only with elevation lines and creek beds. "Family stories suggest it's been untouched for generations." Robert nodded, though I noticed he seemed less enthusiastic than he had been the day before. "It's rough terrain, dense forest, several steep ravines. But if we want to see true wilderness, That's where we'll find it. We broke camp and began hiking toward the unknown region around 9 in the morning. The route Robert chose led us along a series of ridgelines that offered occasional glimpses of the vast forest stretching in all directions. From those vantage points, the settlement looked like an unbroken sea of green, with no visible signs of human presence except for our own small forms moving through the landscape. The terrain grew more challenging as we progressed. We traversed steep hillsides where loose shale threatened to send us sliding into ravines, and crossed creeks that required careful negotiation of slippery rocks and fallen logs. The forest canopy became so dense that even at midday we were hiking in perpetual twilight. Around noon, we stopped for lunch beside a creek that cut through a particularly dramatic ravine. The water had carved a channel 15 feet deep through limestone bedrock, creating pools that reflected the filtered light like dark mirrors. "This is incredible," I said, genuinely awed by the primitive beauty of the place. "It feels like we've gone back in time." "In some ways we have," Robert replied. "This area looks much the same as it did when my great-great-grandfather was young. Before roads, before towns, before most of the changes that shaped the rest of the country." Joe was studying his compass and map, trying to pinpoint our exact location. "According to this, we're about 2 miles from the area marked on the old survey maps as traditional boundary. Nobody's recorded what's beyond that line." "Traditional boundary of what?" I asked. Robert and Joe exchanged one of their looks again. It was Joe who answered. "Boundary of where our people traditionally hunted and gathered. Beyond that line, the land was considered set aside." "Set aside for what?" "For things that needed to be left alone," Robert said quietly. After lunch, we continued northeast, following deer trails when we could find them and bushwhacking when we couldn't. The forest grew even denser, and I noticed that the variety of wildlife sounds I'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 days was gradually diminishing. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming more sparse and distant. Around 3 in the afternoon, we crested a ridge and found ourselves looking down into a valley unlike anything we'd seen so far. The forest there was dominated by enormous white pines, their trunks so massive that it would have taken 4 people holding hands to encircle them. Between the trees, the undergrowth was surprisingly sparse, creating an almost park-like setting that stretched as far as we could see. "Now that's something," Joe breathed. We made our way down into the valley, drawn by the cathedral-like quality of the ancient pine forest. Walking among those giants felt like entering a natural temple, with shafts of golden light penetrating the canopy like stained glass windows. The silence here was different from what we'd experienced the night before, not oppressive, but profound and peaceful. "These trees have to be 300 years old," Robert said in a hushed voice. "Maybe older." I was running my hand along the deeply grooved bark of one massive pine when Robert suddenly stopped walking. His head was cocked to one side, listening intently. "What is it?" Joe asked. "You don't hear that?" We all stood motionless, straining to detect whatever Robert had noticed. For several seconds, I heard nothing except the whisper of wind through pine needles high above. Then faintly, I caught it. A sound that might have been a voice calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Someone else is out here," I said. Robert shook his head slowly. "No. That's not human." The calling came again, clearer this time. It was definitely a voice, and it seemed to be calling my name. "Marcus? Marcus, come here." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "How does it know my name?" Joe grabbed my arm as I started to take a step toward the sound. Don't respond, and don't go toward it." "But someone's calling for me. Maybe they need help." "Marcus?" Robert's voice was sharp with urgency. "Listen to the voice, really listen. Does it sound right to you?" The calling came a third time, and now I could hear what Robert meant. The voice was using my name, but there was something wrong with it. A quality that was almost but not quite human. It sounded like someone doing an imperfect imitation of a person calling for help. "We need to leave," Joe said firmly. "Now." "But now." The urgency in his voice cut through my confusion. We turned and began walking quickly back the way we'd come, but we'd only gone a few dozen yards when the calling started again. This time, it seemed to be coming from a different direction, and the voice had changed subtly. It now sounded like Joe. "Marcus, Robert, where are you going? Come back." I looked at Joe, who was walking right beside me. His mouth was closed, and his face had gone pale. "It's mimicking you," I said. "We need to move faster," Robert said. "And whatever happens, nobody responds to anything we hear. Not your name, not calls for help, nothing." We increased our pace, but the forest around us seemed to be growing thicker and more confusing. Paths I was sure we'd followed on the way in had vanished, and landmarks I thought I remembered looked different or were nowhere to be found. Worse, the voice kept following us, sometimes calling my name, sometimes Joe's, sometimes Robert's. It had mastered each of our voices perfectly, and it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. "This way," Robert said, pointing toward what looked like a game trail leading up the ridge. "We need to get to higher ground." As we climbed, the voices became more frequent and more urgent. They called for help, claimed to be lost, begged us not to leave them behind. The perfect mimicry was bad enough, but what made it truly horrifying was the undertone of hunger in each call, as if whatever was making these sounds was barely containing its excitement at the prospect of luring us closer. We'd been climbing for perhaps 20 minutes when the forest around us suddenly went completely silent. Not the muffled quiet we'd experienced before, but the absolute silence of a place where nothing lived and nothing moved. Even our own footsteps seemed to make no sound. "Jesus," I whispered, then immediately regretted speaking when the silence swallowed my words without even an echo. In that profound quiet, we heard something that made all of us freeze in terror. It was the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, not the normal crashings of a deer or bear, but the deliberate, measured movement of something that was trying to be quiet but was too large to succeed completely, and it was getting closer. Robert signaled for us to move, and we began what could only be described as a controlled retreat up the ridge. The sounds of pursuit followed us, always just beyond the range of visibility, always just quiet enough that we couldn't be sure exactly what we were hearing. When we finally crested the ridge, I looked back into the valley of ancient pines and saw something that I still have trouble believing. There was a figure standing among the trees, tall and thin and somehow wrong in proportions that hurt to look at directly. It was too far away to make out details, but close enough that I could see it watching us with what seemed like infinite patience. "Don't look at it," Robert said sharply. "Keep moving." We descended the far side of the ridge at a pace that bordered on recklessness, sliding down loose scree and jumping over obstacles that should have required careful navigation. Behind us, the calls started again, our own voices, begging us to come back, to not leave whatever was calling alone in the forest. It wasn't until we'd put several miles between ourselves and that valley that the normal sounds of the forest began to return. When they did, we finally allowed ourselves to slow down and catch our breath. "What the hell was that?" I gasped. Robert was silent for a long moment, his hands shaking slightly as he checked our position on the map. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That was why some boundaries exist, why some places are meant to be left alone. As we made camp that night, miles from the Valley of Ancient Pines, I found myself listening constantly for the sound of my own voice calling from the darkness beyond our fire. But the only voices I heard were the real ones of my companions. and for the first time in my life, I understood the difference between those two things with perfect, terrifying clarity. We broke camp before dawn, moving through the gray pre-light with the kind of urgency that comes from spending a night listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. None of us had slept well, and our hushed conversation over instant coffee revealed that we'd all heard things in the darkness. Distant calls, the sound of footsteps circling our camp, whispers that might have been wind but felt far too much like voices. "We need to head south," Robert said, studying his compass and topographical map. "Get back toward the settlement proper." "Agreed," Joe said immediately. "We've seen enough of the deep country." I wanted to argue. Part of me was still curious about what we'd encountered, still trying to rationalize it as some kind of natural phenomenon. But the memory of that figure in the valley, and the perfect mimicry of our voices, made my stomach clench with a fear I'd never experienced before. Whatever was back there, I had no desire to meet it again. We'd been hiking south for about 2 hours when Robert suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. We'd been walking along a ridgeline that offered good visibility, and from our position we could see for miles in most directions. "What is it?" Joe whispered. Robert pointed toward a section of forest below us and to the east. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just trees and undergrowth that looked the same as everything else we'd been walking through. Then Robert handed me his binoculars, and I saw what had caught his attention. Hanging from the branches of several trees were what looked like small wooden structures. They were roughly crafted, appearing to be made from sticks and twigs, bound together with what might have been sinew or plant fiber. Each structure was slightly different, but they all had the same basic form. A framework that reminded me of a simplified human figure, arms outstretched. "What are those?" I asked, handing the binoculars to Joe. "Boundary markers," Robert said grimly. "We crossed into territory we shouldn't have." Joe studied the markers through the binoculars, then lowered them with a troubled expression. "I've heard about these, but I've never seen them. Grandfather used to tell stories." "What kind of stories?" It was Robert who answered. "Stories about areas that were set aside, places where certain things were allowed to exist without human interference. The markers warn people to stay away." "Warn them away from what?" "From becoming food," Joe said quietly. We stood on that ridge for several more minutes, studying the line of markers and trying to understand what they meant for our situation. The wooden figures marked a clear boundary that stretched as far as we could see in both directions, following the contours of the landscape in a way that suggested they'd been placed with careful consideration of the terrain. "So we crossed this boundary yesterday," I said, "when we went into that valley." "Yes," Robert confirmed, "which means we were in its territory when it found us." "Its territory?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to explain. Finally, he spoke in a voice so low I had to strain to hear him. "Wendigo territory. A place where something that was once human but is no longer human makes its home. The markers warn people away because crossing that boundary means you're no longer under the protection of normal laws, natural or spiritual." The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard of Wendigos, of course. Most people familiar with Native American folklore had encountered the stories. But I'd always thought of them as mythology. Cautionary tales meant to teach moral lessons rather than literal descriptions of something that might actually exist. "You're talking about the cannibal creature from the legends," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm talking about what happens when a human being gives in to the worst parts of their nature," Robert replied. "When hunger and greed and selfishness consume everything else that makes them human. What's left isn't human anymore, but it remembers enough about being human to mimic our voices, to call our names, to lure us into places where it can feed." Joe nodded slowly. "The stories say they can read thoughts. At least enough to know who you care about, what voices would make you respond. That's how it knew your name, Marcus. It was listening to our thoughts. A cold realization washed over me. It's still following us, isn't it? Neither of them answered immediately, but their expressions told me everything I needed to know. We resumed our hike south with a new urgency, no longer just retreating from an area that felt uncomfortable, but actively trying to escape something that was hunting us. The next few hours passed in a blur of steep descents and creek crossings. Robert navigated with the skill of someone who'd spent his entire life in these woods, but even he seemed uncertain at times about which path would lead us most quickly to safety. The forest around us felt different now, not just wild but actively hostile. Every shadow seemed to hide a watching presence, and every sound made us freeze and listen for signs of pursuit. Around midday, we heard it again. My voice, calling from somewhere behind us, claiming to be lost and asking for help. This time, none of us even considered responding. We just kept walking, trying to ignore the perfect mimicry and the desperate, hungry undertone that made our skin crawl. "How long will it follow us?" I asked during a brief rest beside a creek. "Until we cross back into protected territory," Robert said. "The boundary markers we saw aren't just warnings. They're also barriers. Sacred boundaries that certain things can't or won't cross. But we're already past the markers. Those were the outer markers. There are others, inner boundaries closer to the settlement proper where stronger protections exist." We continued south, and as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice changes in the forest around us. The trees were smaller and more varied, the undergrowth less dense. Wildlife sounds that had been absent or muted for the past 2 days gradually returned. Birdsong, the chatter of squirrels, the distant drumming of woodpeckers. Around 4 in the afternoon, we came to a creek that was larger than any we'd encountered in the deep country. The water was clear and fast-moving, cutting through a gorge lined with limestone shelves that created a series of small waterfalls and pools. "This is Rushing Water Creek," Robert said with obvious relief. "We're getting close to home ground." As we prepared to cross the creek, jumping from rock to rock to avoid the deeper pools, I heard the voice one more time. It was my own voice again, but this time it sounded different, more distant, and with an edge of frustration that hadn't been there before. "Marcus, don't leave me here, please." I turned to look back across the creek and saw nothing but forest. But I could feel something watching from the trees, something that was no longer trying to hide its presence. The feeling was so intense that it raised goosebumps on my arms despite the warm afternoon air. "It can't cross the water," Joe said quietly. Sacred boundary. Some things about the old stories are absolutely literal. We finished crossing the creek and continued south, but I kept looking back over my shoulder. For the next hour, I had the distinct feeling that something was pacing us on the far side of the water, staying just out of sight but never giving up its pursuit. It wasn't until we'd put several more miles between ourselves and Rushing Water Creek that the feeling of being watched finally began to fade. By evening, when we made camp in a familiar area only a few miles from the settlement proper, the forest felt normal again, wild and alive, but not malevolent. "Tomorrow we'll be back," Joe said as we sat around our campfire, the first fire that had felt truly safe since we'd entered the deep country. "Good," I said, and meant it. I've had enough wilderness for a while. Robert was staring into the flames with a thoughtful expression. "The important thing is that you understand what happened," he said. "You need to know why some boundaries exist, why some old knowledge matters even in the modern world." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I understood anything except that I'd been terrified in ways I'd never imagined possible. "Do you?" Robert asked. "Because the hardest part isn't acknowledging that things like this exist. The hardest part is living with the knowledge that they're still out there, still hungry, still waiting for the next person who doesn't believe in boundaries." As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, listening to the normal sounds of a healthy forest, I thought about what Robert had said. The knowledge that something like a Wendigo could exist, could be real and present and actively hunting, changed everything about how I understood the world. It meant that some of the old stories weren't just stories, and that some warnings weren't just superstition. It meant that there were still places where ancient rules applied, and ancient hungers waited for the foolish or the unwary. I slept badly that night, but for the first time in days, my dreams weren't filled with the sound of my own voice calling from the darkness. We reached the settlement just after noon the following day, emerging from the forest into the familiar landscape of houses and roads that marked the return to human civilization. The transition felt jarring after 5 days in the deep wilderness. The geometric lines of buildings and the sound of vehicles seemed almost alien compared to the organic curves and natural sounds we'd grown accustomed to. Joe's grandmother, Eleanor, was waiting for us on the porch of the family home when we arrived. She was a small woman in her 70s, but there was nothing frail about the way she studied us as we approached. Her dark eyes moved from face to face, reading something in our expressions that made her nod slowly. "You went to the old places," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, grandmother," Joe replied. "We went further than we should have." Eleanor gestured for us to sit on the porch steps while she remained in her rocking chair. Without being asked, Robert began to tell her what we'd experienced, speaking in a mixture of English and Meskwaki. I caught enough of the English portions to follow the general narrative, the strange silence, the voice mimicry, the feeling of being pursued, the boundary markers. When Robert finished his account, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. She rocked slowly in her chair, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. Finally, she spoke. "My grandfather told me stories about that place," she said. "About what lives there and why it must be left alone. I hoped those stories would stay stories, but I knew better." "What did your grandfather tell you?" I asked. Eleanor studied me carefully before answering. "He told me about a man who went into the deep woods during a harsh winter, when food was scarce and people were dying. This man became lost, became desperate, became something other than human when he chose survival over everything else that matters." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "The old ones knew that some choices change you in ways that can't be undone. When you cross certain lines, you become something that can never cross back. The boundary markers aren't just warnings, they're containment. They keep what shouldn't be free from spreading beyond where it belongs." "But why don't more people know about this?" I asked. "Why isn't it common knowledge?" Eleanor's expression became sad. "Because most people wouldn't believe it, and those who would believe it might try to do something about it. Some things are better left contained than confronted." Over the next few hours, as we unpacked our gear and settled back into normal life, I found myself struggling with the implications of what we'd experienced. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find alternative explanations. Hallucinations brought on by stress and exhaustion, some kind of elaborate prank, misidentification of natural phenomena. But the deeper I thought about it, the less those explanations made sense. The voice mimicry had been too perfect, the sense of presence too strong, the boundary markers too real and substantial. Whatever we'd encountered in those woods was not a product of imagination or misperception. It was something that existed independently of our belief in it, something that operated according to rules I was only beginning to understand. That evening, David joined us for dinner and listened to our account with the gravity of someone who'd heard similar stories before. When we finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "You're not the first to encounter the old hunger," he said. "And you won't be the last. The important thing is that you listened when you needed to listen, and you left when you needed to leave." "How do you live with knowing something like that exists?" I asked. "The same way our ancestors lived with knowing it exists," David replied. "With respect for boundaries, with understanding that some places are not meant for human beings, and with the knowledge that the old stories contain more truth than most people want to acknowledge. But doesn't it make you afraid, knowing that something like that is out there? David was quiet for a moment. Fear is useful when it keeps you alive and teaches you respect, he said finally. But fear that paralyzes you or makes you deny reality is dangerous. The Wendigo exists whether we acknowledge it or not. Our choice is whether to live in wisdom or in ignorance. I stayed at the settlement for 2 more days, needing time to process what had happened before returning to my normal life. During those days, I had several more conversations with Eleanor, David, and other tribal elders who were willing to share their knowledge. What emerged was a picture of a world far more complex and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. A world where ancient realities still existed alongside modern life, where old knowledge remained relevant and necessary. The elders spoke of other entities and phenomena that most people dismissed as folklore. Spirits that guarded certain places, creatures that emerged only under specific conditions, areas where the normal laws of physics didn't quite apply. They described a landscape layered with invisible boundaries and populated by things that science couldn't measure, but human beings could definitely encounter. The modern world wants to believe that everything unknown has been mapped and cataloged, Eleanor explained during one of our conversations. But knowledge isn't the same as understanding, and understanding isn't the same as wisdom. Some realities can only be approached with humility and respect. When I finally left the settlement and returned to my regular life, I carried with me a burden I hadn't expected. The weight of knowledge that most people didn't share and wouldn't believe if I tried to share it. I found myself constantly aware of how much was hidden just beneath the surface of ordinary experience. How many layers of reality most people never suspected existed. In the months that followed, I tried several times to return to the kind of wilderness hiking I'd always enjoyed. But something had changed in my relationship with wild places. I couldn't shake the awareness that some forests held more than trees and wildlife, that some silences meant more than the absence of sound, that some boundaries existed for reasons more important than legal or administrative convenience. I still hike, but now I research the areas I visit more carefully. I pay attention to local folklore and listen when indigenous people share knowledge about their traditional territories. I've learned to recognize the signs that indicate when a place should be approached with special caution or avoided entirely. Most importantly, I've learned that the absence of scientific explanation doesn't mean the absence of reality. The world is far stranger and more dangerous than most of us want to acknowledge, and some of that strangeness has been contained rather than eliminated by the boundaries our ancestors established. 6 months after our expedition to the deep country, Joe called to tell me that the boundary markers we'd seen had been renewed. Tribal elders had visited the area and replaced the old wooden figures with new ones, strengthening the warnings for anyone who might venture into that territory. "It's still there," Joe said simply. "Still hungry, still waiting, but the boundaries hold." I understood what he was telling me. The Wendigo hadn't been defeated or driven away. Such things apparently couldn't be defeated in any conventional sense. But it had been contained, held in place by traditions and knowledge that stretched back generations, kept from spreading beyond its designated territory by people who understood the necessity of certain boundaries. That conversation reinforced something the elders had tried to teach me during my stay at the settlement, that some problems can't be solved, only managed. Some realities can't be changed, only acknowledged and respected. And some knowledge carries with it the responsibility to help maintain the barriers that keep dangerous things in their proper places. I've never returned to the deep country of the Meskwaki settlement, and I never will. But I think about it often, about the ancient pines and the profound silence, about the voice that called my name with perfect mimicry and hungry intent, about the boundary markers that stand between civilization and something that should never be allowed to join it. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is moving through the trees outside my house, I listen carefully to make sure the voices I hear are just the voices of wind and leaves. Because now I know the difference between sounds that belong to the natural world and sounds that belong to something else entirely. And I know that somewhere in the deep woods, beyond markers that warn away the living, something that was once human but is human no longer still watches and waits and calls the names of those who venture too close to places where old hungers never die. The ghosts of summer linger longest in places where they shouldn't. I learned that lesson in a forest where the boundaries between past and present, between human and inhuman, between myth and reality, had never really existed at all. And I learned that some knowledge changes you in ways you can never undo, making you a guardian of truths that most people are better off never knowing.